So, hello everybody. I see 40 attendees in our room, so I would suggest that we get us started here at our webinar on China's data-driven approach to COVID-19 management, a study we have just published here at Mercator Institute for China Studies. I am Claudia Wessling, Director of Publications, and I have the honor to guide you through the next 60 minutes, which we will devote to the presentation and discussion of our latest study, which was authored by Christine Schül-Kupfer, Katja Drienhausen, and Kai von Karnap. The China Monitor was published today, and you can find the link posted in the webinar tool here. I would also like to thank the Vodafone Institute for Society and Communications for supporting our research on this study. Special thanks go to Inga Paus, Managing Director of the Vodafone Institute, and to the Head of Communications, Friedrich Pohl, for inspiring conversations and very smooth collaboration we had during these recent weeks. I will hand it over to Inga Paus in a minute for her to say a few words. But before I do that, let me give you a brief housekeeping note. We will be recording this event, and a link to this recording will be on our website by the end of the week. So if you have questions regarding your personal data, please visit our data protection page on our website. The link has also been shared in the chat. But without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Inga Paus for a few words of hello. Inga.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. Let me give you a little bit context why we asked the MERICS or discussed with the MERICS to do this study. So just a few words on the Vodafone Institute. We are the European think tank of the Vodafone Group, sitting here in Berlin, not very close actually to the MERICS, just a bike ride away. And what we do is we research the impact of digitalization on economy and society, and also surely on policy. And what with the corona crisis, it was clear that this has become an accelerator and catalyst for digital transformation. And because we've got so many discussions going on, not only on national level in Germany, but also on European level, how to regulate algorithms, AI, and all the types of general purpose technologies which are coming up now, we thought it's super interesting to look how China is actually handling the pandemic, in particular with digital solutions. And this is why we supported the study, and we are super curious to discuss the results with you, because we learned a lot. I hope you as well. And I wish you a very interesting debate.
Thank you very much, Inga. And I'm also looking forward to an interesting debate. Let me briefly explain the agenda today. We will have a brief discussion, a brief presentation of two of our authors of the study, Katja Drienhausen and Kai von Karnap, will introduce us to the study and lead us into the main findings they discovered during their research. Afterwards, we will have a short but high-level panel, and I'm very proud to say this, to discuss the findings and also hear the comments from our experts. We have 4 panelists altogether, and I'm really happy that we could convince Hinrich Tolken, a special representative for international digitalization policy and digital transformation at the German Federal Foreign Office, to join us here today. And I'm also very glad that Peter Paricek managed to come in here in time. He had another important meeting in the morning and he made it to join us. So thanks, Peter, for being here. Peter is the head of Center of Competence Public IT at Fraunhofer Focus Institute. He also holds a professorship at Krems University in Austria, and he's a member of the Digital Council of the German federal government. So, but before I tell you more about how the panel will run, and of course you as our attendees will have plenty of opportunity to ask us questions, either via the Q&A function in Zoom or live with your voice. I suggest we first open the stage for Katja and Kai for their presentation of the study, and I will try to move the slides for you, Katja and Kai, whenever you're ready.
Right, yes, thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you, Paus, for the nice introduction. I'll be starting with our paper introduction Maybe you can go one slide ahead, Claudia. Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's the one. So we tried to understand the basic digital and data-driven solutions that were part of China's overall strategy to combat the novel coronavirus. And many of you have heard maybe about the QR tracing apps and flying drones to enforce health regulations and so on and so forth. But we wanted to give a bit of an overall grand assessment overview of all the applications deployed, and also assess the risks and benefits that the Chinese Communist Party has basically faced in the process. And maybe you can move one slide ahead, Claudia. Thank you. So what we found, maybe not to the surprise of many, that China has been very swift and fast to deploy a whole variety of data-driven solutions. We have strong public governmental support starting in January already with the first committee probing for first ideas, and the MIT, the Chinese Ministry for Information Technology, followed suit in also supporting public projects in this regard, as well as governmental projects. And maybe most interesting to see, if we basically cluster them all together, is that on one side we have the data according to mobile phone tracking and through various channels that could be either on a macro scale that would help to visualize and monitor population movement, but also maybe understand the movement of high-risk groups and high-risk regions better. But that would also be on a micro level, where we have these QR tracing apps that would allow individual access to buildings and to housing complexes and public transport. In the second cluster, we find the smart city infrastructure that we probably know mostly through facial recognition technology, but that's also where we find the drones and maybe automated robots to disinfect streets and housing complexes and buildings. And in the third cluster, we find the healthcare sector that has been digitalized over the last few years, but has now made a divisive step forward to also fall back on staff management platforms, but also offer free online consultation services that were very crucial in alleviating some of the stress that came with the first big wave of corona outbreak. Another important point is probably that the public-private partnership was one of the key elements of this whole development, where the companies followed very close to the governmental wish to deploy digital solutions, where, for example, the case of Hangzhou, where the city went into lockdown, I think in the 2nd or 3rd of February, and then only 5 days later, Alibaba had already come up with a QR tracing code that then was subsequently rolled out citywide. Only within 5 days, and that's still deployed today, and that's probably also the one that you heard most of. Now, I think what also is important to mention amongst the many things that I think are interesting in this whole grand strategy is that they also were digital data-driven solutions were also they replaced some of the conventional epidemic and prevention control measures, such as paper-based health certificates or manual temperature checks on the scale that we probably wouldn't see here at such a quick pace in Europe. And with this, I want to give it to Katja to look at the sort of data privacy regime that supported this. I think you're still mute, Katja.
Thank you, Kai and Claudia. If you could switch it to the next slide, please. I want to start with saying that the quick response that Kai just described would not have been possible without a number of policies that essentially preceded it and that laid the foundation, the digital architecture that is for these various new solutions that were tested out. I'm particularly thinking about the digitalization plans of the last 5 to 10 years that also actually place quite a strong emphasis on the health sector. And also on the cross-departmental and cross-regional merging of data. Now, China is not, of course, a perfect digital state, but these policies and policy priorities are reflected in the laws and regulations that govern both the collection and the use of personal data, especially of sensitive personal data. And that has led to the effect that essentially the regulatory framework reflects the party states' view of data as a governance resource, as something to be used to more effectively formulate policy responses to gain control of emerging situations. What is quite clearly from the data protection regulatory regime itself is that the legislation is still highly fragmented. There is no data protection law or anything akin to the GDPR, for example. And what stands out really is that it is quite focused on the private sector, while much less constraints are put on public organs, on state organs, in what data they can gather, access, and how they have to protect it. Now, what that did, it allowed the government to gather data quickly on public emergency grounds and merge data pools. And this ability, in a sense, was also the basis for the quick emergence of public-private partnerships in addressing the crisis that Kai just described. Now, what the crisis has also highlighted is not just a quick response based on this quick access to data, but also the weak protection of privacy rights and the sort of secondary effects that can have on citizens. Now, while in the regulations, and there were regulations released by the Cyber Safety Administration of China as well on what data to use and how to use it. It's still stated that, for example, the tracing apps, which a lot of the focus has been on, that they would be voluntary. But what has happened was that, in fact, they became mandatory due to their gatekeeper function, allowing citizens no effective decision on to share or not to share their data with state organs and private enterprises. What was also quite visible was shortcomings in data security, in the protection of personal data. There were quite a large number of leaks reported, especially local governments quite freely accessed and shared the data to knock on people's home doors, so to say, to target special groups, especially from highly affected regions, for example, from Wuhan, leading also to stigmatization. And this is not just due to the relatively loose regulatory environment, but what is really visible here is the institutional setup that is or is not effect in China. There is a relatively low legal awareness amongst especially local governments and those who implement and enforce the epidemic containment measures, and a lack of institutional oversight in the sense of data protection officers, in the sense of NGOs, of other organizations that you can turn to when your personal information has been shared illegally. Claudia, if you could move it to the next slide for just a very brief discussion of the main differences that we also found in comparing sort of the best practices advocated by the Chinese government vis-a-vis what was addressed or discussed in the European Union. I think an important thing to note is that the tracing app specifically had a much larger scope. It was about real name identification of individuals. It was about being able to use them as an enforcement tool of quarantine, whereas here, especially the current German solution is still focused on anonymity and really enabling the individuals to take action. Also, while in China you did have to click consent once to install the app, it's vastly different from the approach taken here, where I'm actually informed of who gets your data, how long it will be stored, and what will happen to it. And with this, I would like to hand it back to Kai for a final assessment.
Yes, thank you, Katja. And maybe Claudia can also move it to the next slide. Yes, we wanted to, in the third part, assess China's data-driven management in regards to the attached risks and benefits that the Chinese party basically faced, or maybe the question that they faced, to put it bluntly, was it or is it really worth it? Can these digital technologies that are barely tested in many cases or have little to no precedence in crisis management, or let alone combat of a pandemic of the scale of Corona, and can they be reliable and robust enough of a tool to be deployed in the way that we've seen? And also in the second step, as I mentioned, because they have also in some cases replaced conventional epidemic prevention control measures, can they outperform the conventional human-controlled oversight, if you will? So we don't have one answer to this question, but partially because we're still in the middle of this crisis and we probably, it's a bit too early to write down a grand total on this, but we try to describe the nexus in which the CCP has basically operated between the benefits and risks. Yeah, following the logic of our paper along the lines of the 3 technologies, but also the data regime, but also including public response. And without going into too much detail of this graph that you see here, I think the one, what seems to be a reoccurring theme seems to be that the risks are largely taken by the Chinese population, where we don't know whether the distortion of the pandemic due to maybe faulty algorithms or not ready technology might prolong the spread, but we also have seen a further infringement of privacy rights. On the other side, we have benefits that cater largely to the interest of the party states by rekindling, restarting the economy, or leapfrogging and boosting some of the technological capabilities, also in regards to surveillance technology. And with this, I want to hand it back to Claudia, and thank you for your interest, and I'm looking forward to some interesting debates and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kai and Katja, for your input. So very interesting developments we are seeing in China. You described very well how fast they moved. And I might add the information that's in the study that so far more than 540 apps related to health management or crisis containment are listed on China's information platform on epidemic prevention and control. So we see that also due to this special legal system Katja described, China could move very fast here. And I'm very happy now to enter into the small panel discussion on our study and maybe take it even a step further and dealing with the question to what extent such digital tools not only change the health sector, but also whole societies, as we can currently see with the corona crisis. Let me briefly repeat again who will be on our panel. Hinrich Tölken is the Special Representative for International Digitalization Policy and Digital Transformation at the German Federal Office. Peter Paricek is a member of the Digital Council of the German Federal Government and also Head of Center of Competence Public IT at Fraunhofer Focus. In the beginning, I forgot to mention that, of course, Inger Paus, the Managing Director of the Vodafone Institute, will be joining us and maybe answer a few of my questions. And also Christine Schulkupfer, our Research Director of Politics and Society here at Merits, will talk about her view on the developments and also answer the questions of the audience afterwards. So my first question would actually go to our two male guests. Inger and Christine, I hope you can understand if I ask our guests to comment first. Hinrich Tölken, you are not only a diplomat, you're also a trained physician, currently specializing in digitalization and digital transformation. You told me in our phone call that you are not an expert in health policies, so I'm not going to ask any details here, but it still sounds as if you're the right person to comment on the topic. So if you look at China's performance in this profound health crisis and how it tried to use digital tools to get things under control, to what extent, to your mind, could Germany or Europe learn from the Chinese model? Should we be, I'm playing devil's advocate here, less suspicious of the swift implementation that came along with flaws, but still it went very quickly? What would be your take here?
Yeah, thank you for having me here, and I very much appreciate being in this August round of experts to discuss the study. First, to start off with a comparison from the medical background, I think if we treat a disease in a human being with a drug, we should always be aware of the side effects that we cause. And if the side effects are worse than the actual disease, I think the doctor should step back a minute and think about what he or she is doing. If we compare this to what we have seen in the fight of the pandemic, I think the result, the performance that we should look at are the figures of the people who actually suffered from the disease and those who died. And I think if we look at the figures in China, they look good, but the figures in Germany surprisingly also look very good. So there's no, let's say, big discrepancy in how it was handled. We had different paths to come to a similar outcome here. What worries me is that there's a trend to exploit Corona as a pretext to better control the society. And this is what I see and what I read in the study. And this is not the first time that it happens in history. It has been used as a pretext before. And as a cynical observer, I could also say such a pandemic, such an epidemic is actually the dream of an autocrat, because it allows the government, the regime, to exercise more control on movement of the society, and also to use digital tools to boost compliance with public health healthcare measures. I think it was not mentioned in the presentation, but it was could be found in the study that also the social credit score system has been mobilized to enhance, let's say, compliance with the healthcare measures. I think this is extremely worrying. And what I've read about things in China is that it has created a lot of a sense of safety and convenience in the population, which is good, it's fine. But this safety and convenience were traded against diminished transparency and doubts about data security and even actual abuse of data, as we have just heard in the study. So I think this is a very worrying trend. And I believe in fighting an epidemic, one should always have the bigger picture in mind. And I very much prefer the app that we have actually established here in Germany, and the figure of 12 million downloads in the first week or so, reaching 15% of the population, which is an important threshold, shows that also voluntary measures can lead to a very good result. I have my doubts about the long-term results of the additional, let's say, surveillance instruments that were put in place with this app, and we have to see in the long run whether this leads to even more, let's say, control, more management of a society. I'm very happy about the discussion that we have here in Germany, that we do not want the ability to trace and track individual users of the Corona app, that we should rather keep it anonymous in the decentralized version. I think this is the appropriate way to go. And I know there's often this saying that China has acted more swiftly, more efficiently, with more determination. May be right, but then again, we have acted with more respect for data security and privacy, and we should perhaps stop dreaming the dream that we can be as efficient and as, let's say, forceful in our reaction as an autocratic regime can be, and at the same time preserving all the transparency and openness and liberty as we have. I'd rather have our own approach than, let's say, trying to copy the Chinese approach. That's for the time being for me.
Thank you, Hinrich. Peter Paricek, what would be your take? I mean, Hinrich is pretty critical about what's happening in China, and many of our colleagues here would say rightfully so. There is areas to watch and to look for. One of your specialties is public IT, and you are also advising to the German Digital Council. If you were asked by the government, how should we deal with this, what's going on in China, what would you tell them?
I think it's, so in general, I cannot start the video. I think the US host needs to. I will
ask Antonia, our administrator, to do it in a second.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it's so in general, it's I think very interesting question. But what is COVID-19? Does it lead to new phenomena, or is it just increasing the speed of change? And in many discussions we see it's not really new phenomena. It's just increasing existing change processes. And if you look to the development of China, and I had the pleasure to read an article last week, it was fascinating. It was very well described how a city changed from a non-using data organization to a super smart city. And they were really proud to establish smart surveillance, and they call it also smart surveillance. And in the first phase, so that's 10 years ago, they started to link all their databases, all their registers, which we know from the public administration. So, and as we know, that's an ongoing discussion in Germany and in Europe. And at the moment, we have a very clear answer to that. We do not want to link all the databases. We are only allowed to link databases if we have a legal foundation for using data from different areas. And I think that's a very good situation for a healthy democracy, that we agree on that. But that's not the case in China, and that started 10 years ago. The second phase was that they started to really build big data applications. So they started the surveillance by cameras. They started smart grids. So they started to collect additional data which was not collected before. So then there was, I would say, the first step into a smart city. But in a smart city, which is not comparable with discussions which we have in democratic states. So that was the second phase, and they also defined their cities in grids. And for each grid, they have a grid manager, and he looks at the data. And if there is an anomaly, then the system informs, and that people check in real life if something is getting wrong in this grid. And one grid, in this example, which I had some interviews, the grid was 300 families. So just imagine that how many grid masters they need to have the perfect overview. So that was 5 years, 7 years ago. Maybe in the meantime, they extended the grid because of the technology is improving, so that the technology can find out anomalies, so that there is something happening in the grid and then check in real life. So I think that's not, we can't imagine that that's happening, but this is an ongoing process in China, and that's 7 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago. And in the third phase, they started, you called it public-private partnerships. That sounds nice, because we also have public-private partnerships, but they started public-private partnerships in data sharing. With Alibaba, for example, Alipay. So they included in the third phase, they included also data from companies. And so that gives them the perfect view of their city. And this was without COVID-19. So what happened with COVID-19, they just added the next step and brought in more data and used, because the data was already here, very extensively, the existing data in the cities. The example I'm referring to is one of the leading smart cities in China. There are different indexes. This is Wuhu with 79%, with 97 points, compared Shanghai is something like 82, and if I remember that correctly. So to give you the answer is that you can't compare China with Europe, because they started a data-driven surveillance 10 years ago, and now they do the perfection of it. And this data is also the basis for the social index, which you mentioned. This data is the base for the COVID-19 surveillance program. So you can't compare that, and it's not copy and paste for Europe. Thanks God, it's not copy paste to Europe. So
and what would be the European solution to your mind? I mean,
what we discussed in Austria very intensively, and in Germany very intensively, it's only a decentralized solution. So where we do not track, but we trace the contacts in a decentralized way. In Austria, even the data is not handed over to authorities. It's only the information for people, and then they need to decide themselves if they do a testing, if they reduce their social contacts. So we are a liberal democracy. So people are also and needs to make their own decisions. And I think it's so we did it. I would say we did it definitely right. Now we can discuss if it's possible with this decentralized data, which is stored on our mobile phones, if there are possibilities to use the data for scientific purposes. I had a discussion with a colleague from University of Linz, and he said he is able to do that without personalized data. Yeah, we will see in the in the next phase of Corona, so in autumn, if we will make a next step and think about how we could use this decentralized data in an anonymous way to predict the next clusters. I think that's an issue because that's at the moment not possible with the solutions which we have in Germany and Austria. And if there's a next wave, then we need to identify the clusters in a very early stage. And therefore, I think we need to have another discussion afterwards. But I think now we did it completely right.
So a decentralized approach for Europe, which is more in line also with the system here, the societal system we have. Maybe this is, Peter, you mentioned corporate responsibility in this context and how China makes use of private companies' innovation to build up its surveillance system. Maybe this is the point where I could bring in Inga Paus again. Inga, you're the chairwoman of the management board of Vodafone Foundation, and the Vodafone Institute, of which you are the managing director, has dedicated itself to be a sort of platform, also promoting corporate responsibility strategies in the digital realm. When you're looking at this development in China and the responsibility of corporates over there also, what do you think Europe should do? How should they engage with corporates here to make for a digital development that actually benefits society over here?
Yeah, interestingly, that was the starting point of the debate with Christian Kupfer and the colleagues here, Kai and Katja, because the questions we had was basically how is public sector governance, like government strategies on data governance and how to leverage these data, kind of mingled with private sector data strategies, right? And I mean, you see quite a mingling in China, which is actually, let's say, not thinkable in Europe, right? So what's interesting, and this is also connected to with the debate on COVID, there was a high-level group on the EU level on business-to-government data sharing in the last legislation period, and this discussion is continuing. So basically, trying to find out how we can create data pools, right, which we are lacking in Europe, right, to deliver insights in different domains like health and education, industry. And this is actually the foundation for AI. If we want to be competitive in the AI space, we need this access to data. And it's not personal data per se, it can be anonymized, aggregated data. And I think learning from this COVID pandemic, what happened actually in China, and tried to kind of set the framework and the foundation for business to government collaboration in that space in Europe, this is something which we need to fix in the 5 years of the current EU legislation. And I think I give you one example. So we are sitting on let's say really interesting mobility data, and we started a malaria epidemic project supported by the Gates Foundation that was done by some colleagues in London from the big data team, and the models they built could luckily be applied to the COVID pandemic. So the colleagues started to model actually what happened in Italy and Spain if the containment strategies of the governments worked actually and how effective they were. Because this is the main question, coming back to Hinrich. Actually, does digital help at all, right? Does it provide insights and solutions which really help to, let's say, lessen the collateral damage of such pandemics and other incidents? So, and the insights we got were really interesting for the national governments. And we did this within the GDPR framework. So the GDPR actually didn't hinder us to provide these insights, just the opposite. It provided us legally safe ground and rule of law where we could operate within these principles. So I think it's from a private sector perspective, we did this for free, right? We provided these insights for free because it was simply such an urgency here. But I think we need to come to models where the private sector and public sector on European level work together and create these kind of insights and data, and that, but within a, let's say, collaboration and partnership, which is sustainable, right? So a lot of questions related to business to government data sharing. And I think China is an interesting example, actually, what we potentially want to avoid in Europe.
Thank you, Inga. I saw Hinrich raising his hand. So Hinrich, maybe you have a comment here.
Yes, thank you. Just a short remark. If you look what the COVID-19 shock has caused, I mean, we heard that in China there was a lot of preparation already with the previous steps in direction of digital transformation. And we've always said in Germany, we are far behind, we are still completely analogous. But the shock of the corona crisis has perhaps even created a bigger impact here. Because if I look at my own institution, the Federal Foreign Office, what went out of the window almost immediately was this obsession with being only physical presence means that you're doing actual work. This is completely gone and forgotten. We have created a lot of agility, flexibility, mobility, things that were completely impossible before are just now completely normal and self-evident. We had a discussion amongst all the directors generals in the Foreign Office this morning. I mean, some of them were sitting at home. Had you done this 6 months before, you would have been thrown out, I believe. So this is something that has created a big, big change and perhaps even a bigger disruption here in Germany than in China, if I may say so.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, most of us can tell that from their own work experience. There have been many, many changes, and not only for the worse. Let me, before I open this for our attendees here, let me ask a question to Christine Schukupfer. She worked together with Kai and Katja on the study. She's our research director, politics and society at Merix, and of course, Christine is watching developments in China on a continuous basis. So if you were to tell us the future, Christine, what would you say, where will this ongoing digital transformation of China lead to? What kind of China will we see in, let's see, 10 years? And what should Europe make of this?
Yeah, I can't tell you the future, unfortunately, but I would like
I was hoping for that.
I would like to suggest 2 points where we should look to in the future, and they actually have both mentioned or have been both mentioned already. So one element, Mr. Tolkien mentioned that also from Mrs. Pauls, sorry for that, and others. The development in terms of how the Chinese government manages not to integrate data, also to continuously use and tap into the data sources which they have, in a sense, open up now, using, so to say, COVID-19 in terms of mobility data, also health data, obviously. And if they manage, and to what extent they manage to also merge this with other data streams, which also feed into the social credit system framework and the various blacklists and data banks which are attached to that. And I mean, it's of course a wider topic of data management and how the social credit system framework will evolve, which is also due to show some national effect or impact this year in terms of unification, centralization of data on a national level. So this is one element to watch. Is China also really harvesting big data? I mean, it's not only clearly about the quantity of data, this is very important, and we've heard this already, but how you integrate and manage and also make it qualitatively useful data also to build further analysis and tracking and efficiency improvements on this. A second element I think we should pay much more attention to, and that has been also mentioned, Claudia, you mentioned that also, the societal dimension of this whole effort. I think China is also increasingly moving into a direction, and also not different from our debates here in terms of privacy. What is the value of my personal data? Whom should I trust? What do I want in terms of protection and also transparency of the algorithms? So in that sense, the Chinese society is not that different from ours. Yes, of course, there is convenience and people had a sense of security. That's also something we found out in our study. But we also saw a boost in privacy debates, which has been there before. So I also wonder how this will evolve. And I think also what the study makes clear, and it's also clear when we look at how other governments, also in Taiwan, for example, or Hong Kong or Japan has managed this technology follows people or serves people, right? If you don't have a transparent communication system, if you don't take people along, explain to them why things are happening. And this is really something we're doing well in Europe overall, I would say, and other Asian countries have done this also a lot better than China, honestly. So how this technology will evolve within the broader societal and political framework, right? If China also, again, could use this as an advantage, or do we also see the risks unfolding, as Kai has mentioned, specifically on a societal level? So I think we should not only look what the Chinese government is doing, but we should also pay a lot of attention how the Chinese society will react to that, and also will try to shape as much as they can, of course, giving the limited participation space, but try to shape also debates on privacy, and Chinese engineers and experts, of course, first and foremost. Thank you very much, Claudia.
Thank you, Christine. Ending with big questions. So, dear audience, you're now very welcome to come up with your questions. I will show a slide how that works. You can either send me a question into the Q&A channel. It's located at the bottom of your Zoom window, and then I can share the questions with the panel. You can also just use the raise hand option, and then we will send you a prompt to unmute your microphone, and you can ask the question directly orally to the panel. And of course, also to our presenters, Katja and Kai, if there is questions. So you're all very welcome to speak up. I actually do already have one question, which has a bit of a technical nature here. So while I'll ask that, everyone else in the audience can now think about what else he or she wants to ask. Let me read the question, and maybe that's something for Kai or Katja to answer. It's a question from Peter Kesselborg, and he asks, would it be too far-fetched to compare the health code to an internal visa system, since the color of your dynamic QR code determines your freedom to travel around your city and to other provinces? So that's technical. Sounds like a Kai kind of question, but
yeah, I think I mean it's a question that's kind of difficult to answer because they're so fundamentally different concepts. I think you could, on a conceptual level, kind of compare it. The difference is maybe that in China the QR codes are very proliferated. We have hundreds of apps that issue different kinds of health codes and colors. We have the one that we talked about earlier from Alibaba and Tencent, that is probably the most widely used, but many different provinces and cities have rolled out their own different apps. We have companies, also including Alibaba, that specifically cater to one kind of industry, for example, education industry, where we have schools that you have a different kind of code. We have public transport apps that work on a national level to also sort of feed into the national movement that is sort of not detached to what Alibaba is doing. So there are a lot of different actors, and right now basically there is a race to find the best way, and the government is basically trying to figure out which of the apps, if there would be only one, is the one to use, or if you want to have different apps for different contexts. So I guess on that level it differs from what the visa really is, and yeah, on top of this, is really not regulated the space of QR code apps. So I think yeah, more than the concept of allowing someone in or out or movement at all, there's not much similarity. That's what you were asking for.
Thank you, Kai, and I hope the question was aptly answered here. I have a hand raised, Victor Buzna, and I hope that our technical host can unmute you here. Victor Buzna, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Claudia, and hello, everyone. Thank you for this meeting. Yes, my name is Victor, a journalist based in Budapest, and my question goes to Kai and Katja. I was wondering if you have experienced any development for the second phase. I know it's just happening right now, so maybe it's difficult to answer, but it would be still nice to see if anything has changed. And also I was wondering if, I think it's a 5G related issue. So I was wondering that what's going on with this 5G term. I mean, is 5G used at all to fight the virus? If you have any information on this. Thank you.
So would Kai?
Yeah, maybe on the 5G issue. So that's partially involved in the QR tracing. The problem is that the rollout is happening, but it also depends a lot on what devices people use, and not all of the devices are 5G ready. So most of the QR codes also use location tracking based on geo-satellite navigation, so by Beidou or GPS equivalent of China. And in this space, you would want to have a device that is ready for 5G, otherwise it doesn't really work. And there are sort of PR stunts, I would call them so far, that include 5G as part of their QR code apps. How much they really are integrated, I can't tell, because most of these algorithms that basically assess people's likelihood of having contracted the virus are really intransparent. We don't know how they really assess the colors. So more than the PR behind that, you also can find there's a lot of English PR on this as well. I'm not sure how much that really is part of it. Oh, sorry, and what was the first question again?
Actually, it was about the second wave, and Kai, if you don't mind, actually I would come in here. I think what recent outbreaks in northern China, then the current one in Beijing, have also shown is that, of course, digital solutions, they're no panacea, right? They cannot prevent renewed outbreaks. They're but one sort of part in the puzzle of different measures that need to be taken and upheld for a long time to effectively manage the outbreak. What maybe should be mentioned as well in terms of long-term management of the crisis is that, especially in China, the digital and the analog capabilities go hand in hand. Yes, the apps allowed access to a lot of data. They were able to draw on real names, identify people, actually send out quarantine orders, in the sense permitting people to enter or exit buildings or telling them to stay at home. But someone had to go and enforce it. And this is where I want to draw sort of the attention again to the grid management system that was mentioned by Peter Paricek before, but that we also took a closer look in the form of a policy brief at the beginning of this year, which you can also find on our homepage. And that sort of the sort of broad capabilities that were mobilized by the Communist Party in terms of presence in communities that went around to make sure that measures were actually enforced, played a key role. And on the note of enforcement, of course, the social credit system sort of as a monitoring tool, as a system of blacklists to draw attention what the main policy priorities are, what citizens should follow to sort of blame and shame those who violated the containment measures, such as hygiene standards in companies, such as leaving the home without being allowed to or while being infected. All those have played a key role. So it's not just isolated technical solutions, but it's part of a very large apparatus, so to say.
Katja, that fits in nicely with the question I have here, and you already started to elaborate. Vera Witkin wants to know how the social credit system has been adapted with regard to health issues.
Maybe just very briefly on that. I mean, the social credit system itself is built to be highly adaptive. In essence, it looks at what laws and regulations the government thinks people should follow right now, because what it essentially does, it amplifies the effect of or the outcome of offenses, right? If you violate your, for example, quarantine measures, you're not just sanctioned by one department. You're not just getting a fine. Your name might be published online. There's a much higher price to pay for non-compliance, so to say. And that has been used quite quickly also to enforce compliance with regulations, just by different both on the national level, but on regional levels, with government departments and governments coming out with new regulations saying, if you do this, that, or anything else that violates quarantine, epidemic management measures, you will be recorded via the social credit system. So it is a targeted instrument, so to say.
Thank you, Katja. I see another raised hand here in the audience. Dominic Behnke. Antonia, my support, maybe you could unmute Dominic. And Dominic, it would be great if you briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Dominic Binke. I'm student in the China studies of the Hochschule Bremen, and I'm at the moment in the bachelor studies, and at the moment I'm in China, in Shanghai, so I got all these things here from the first hand, and so this is quite interesting topic for me today, what will be discussed. And I have basically 3 questions now I want to raise. The first of all is from a Chinese friend who listened to this with me, is pretty quite interested in this, and said how I want to ask how this data contributes to the social credit system. Is there maybe some changes made through the people within through the system later, because we already know that the social credit system gathers a lot of data and also goes into the social behavior. They try literally everything. How do I treat my parents, and they have many different things in it. So so how does this data contribute? What kind of effect could this have on the people's behavior or on the control of them? And and how to break out of the system. That's like the first question of this bundle of questions raised from my Chinese friend.
Dominic, may I ask you to make it brief, because I have many other questions, so please.
Sorry, I couldn't see. And the second and third is quite short. What we all know that China is trying to influence Europe, and we notice this in many things, and they're trying to export the system. So how can we make people aware in Europe if China is trying to incorporate this kind of system or their kind of legal understanding of data using into Europe? Even if we have these discussions now, it's not it's not an insurance for this that this would be that this would be noticed by the people in Europe. So and how we can stay aware on this Chinese thing. Sorry.
Thank you. The first question was kind of already answered by Katja. I don't know if you want to add something regarding social credit system.
Maybe just to emphasize again that at least at this stage, at the national level, what is institutionalized, the social credit system is still mainly focused on tracking legal compliance, right? You have some rewards for good behavior, but it's mostly about sanctioning illegal or sort of non-compliant behavior. It is much less about tracking your individual behavior. So at this moment, since you don't have a legal obligation to be healthy, that is not tracked, but you do have a legal obligation to listen to the government when they give you a quarantine order. So this is mainly the data that is collected and reflected. But it will be very interesting, of course, to watch how the system evolves in the future, which is another of our research areas, and happy to address that in a later event.
And on the question how to make Europeans aware, I mean, that's an interesting question. Studies like ours here are created to make Europeans aware. Any thoughts on the panel, what else could be done?
Well, I think one thing that definitely has to be assessed, and Dominic and others probably also have experienced this already, and I've heard this from a couple of foreigners who live in China, friends and also business people, also seeing how the new situation with entry to China evolves, right? Do these apps also work sufficiently enough in English? Because obviously not every foreigner can be asked or can master the Chinese language. So, and how this will be linked to, then they also have a specific number, or has that to be linked to a Chinese bank account, which not necessarily all tourists have. So, I mean, this is also, of course, potentially something that will already definitely affects foreigners who live in China, but also how this will be handled on a short-term basis with people re-entering China. Korea has just recently put out, a whole set of regulations, how they think this could tie in with visa regulations and quarantine regulations on a more permanent basis for foreign visitors. And it will be interesting to see how China also then intends to handle this, right? Will we be forced to also install the app, or so that's definitely something to be closely watched and of close interest to anybody who travels to China then.
Thank you, Christine. I will take the two last questions and I will summarize them for you because we have already reached the end. Time flies when you're having fun. One question, very short, is there an exchange of data between apps? And the second question, this one was from Martin Aldrovandi, and the second question from Corinne Abele, concerns private-public data sharing. Is there a legal framework for the cooperation we see in China at all? Or is what we see happening in a gray area? And in addition, how do you divide public and private data in China? For instance, data owned by SOEs, energy data, etc. So maybe the first one is something for Kai, and with the other, I don't know yet. Is there a data exchange in apps?
That's a very good question. We have a current problem, or a problem that was very relevant in the early month. I'm not sure how it is right now today, but where these apps develop basically in a very fragmented way, where local governments and companies try to build their own systems based on different kind of data sets, often in different coded languages, and we have strong interoperability issues. That was at least publicly acknowledged by a think tank by the Chinese government that tried to streamline these apps. And I know there were first attempts, at least by the tech companies Alibaba and Tencent, to push for stronger interoperability, to make people also able to travel from one place to another without actually having to download different apps and then wait maybe 14 days for sufficient enough movement profile, which is part of it, and so on and so forth. So there is a strong attempt for this. How well they interoperate and how they share data today, I think I'm not entirely aware of large corporate agreements, but I think there would be an interest of companies to also fence against these and try to stay sort of independent, because the data sets that they use to assess people's health is what these apps thrive off of. So I think there will be different momentums that have to be balanced, and this fragmentation will perhaps not be resolved in the next few weeks or months.
Thank you, Kai. And Corinne's question, who would want to take that one?
Yeah, actually, I'm happy to take that one as well, and maybe refer also back to the study, because actually there we look a bit more at the legal framework in regard to personal data, especially that sets sort of the framework for cooperation between the government and companies here. It doesn't necessarily, like the existence of a regulatory framework doesn't necessarily mean that part of what is happening now isn't happening in a gray area, especially when it comes to the protection of data and what data is exchanged and how long it is stored. I think it is important to note that, especially in the early stages, there was a clear political message, like a shout out from the top of government, if you will, to use data to combat the epidemic quickly. And so it was much more of a general atmosphere of let's go and try it, rather than seeing, than checking, for example, the personal data protection information standards, if what we're doing right now is compliant. I think this is part of what's happening now. There are regulatory bodies in China that also do track compliance with the existing, although a bit more loose data protection requirements. But in light of the large scope of data that is being collected and processed, their capabilities are just not enough. If you look at how many complaints, requests they're getting every day, sort of the lack of institutionalized data protection offices or organizations that people can turn to, it's quite clear that although there is regulation, it is often just not enforced, but also because political priority is given to sort of tackling the issue first and then dealing with the, let's say, the data privacy outfall later?
Thank you, Katja. So one can also gather that there's a lot of more need to look into this developing story in China. I would like to wrap it up at this point. At Merix, we're always in time, and take the opportunity to once again thank our panelists, Hinrich Tölken and Peter Paricek, also for their very open and analytical remarks on how Europe should deal with this, and that some of the directions that China is taking are definitely not for Europe, that this is a good example to study, but Europe needs its own strategy here, and you've offered a couple of very interesting ideas, and I'm sure our researchers would like to discuss with you one day. Also, thanks again to the Vodafone Institute, Inga Paus and Friedrich Pohl for this very interesting collaboration. And thanks to Christine, Katja, and Kai, of course, and to all of you, dear attendees, for bearing with us and staying on till the end. We have more publications and webinars upcoming, so please stay tuned to our brand new website. We also take feedback for that. To look for updates. Tomorrow, for instance, we will be publishing our Institute's newsletter, the Merix Update. If you like, you can sign up. Our website is in the chat also. You can look at the study at our website to delve into details. And our next webinar is also coming up on July 1st. Our analyst John Lee has invited experts to discuss the topic China as an AI superpower. I don't know if this is on the website yet, so maybe I'm prematurely stating things here, but please check. And yeah, that's it for today. Thanks to everyone. Have a good day and enjoy yourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.